The hospital had always been a second home to me. Its fluorescent lights, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the faint scent of antiseptic that clung to every surface. I'd walked those halls for years, learned every shortcut, every quiet corner, every nurse's habits, and every doctor's quirks. But that night, everything felt wrong the moment I stepped out of my office. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the entire building had inhaled and refused to exhale. I didn't understand it at first, I only felt it, like a shadow stretching long and silent behind me. It had already been a long shift. I was exhausted, my shoulders tight with the weight of back-to-back emergencies, and I was more than ready to go home. The clock read nearly past midnight, and the usual bustle of night staff had dwindled down to small clusters of movement here and there. I grabbed my coat and my bag, checked my phone, 4 missed calls from an unknown number, and shrugged it off as another late-night pharmacy or insurance inquiry. Nothing unusual. But then I heard hurried footsteps behind me. "Dear! Lena!" a voice called out, breathless. I turned to see Maria, the head nurse, rushing toward me with a look I had never seen on her face before. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes wide, and her breathing came in quick, shallow bursts. Maria wasn't the panicking type. She'd worked in trauma for 15 years. She'd seen gunshot wounds, mass casualties, and everything in between. But the way she looked at me made my heartbeat stumble. "What's wrong?" I asked as she skidded to a stop in front of me. "You need to come with me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right now." I tried to ask what happened, if it was an emergency, if someone coded, if a patient was missing, but she shook her head sharply. "Not here. Not where anyone can hear." That sent a chill through me. The idea that there was something dangerous enough that even speaking about it in the hallway was risky didn't make sense. Yet her expression told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just another night. She grabbed my wrist and guided me through corridors I hadn't walked in months. Storage hallways, supply wings, maintenance paths used only during renovations. As we moved deeper, the hospital noises faded away. No chatter, no footsteps, no machines. Just the low hum of the overhead lights. "Maria," I said, slowing down, "you're scaring me." "What is going on?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pushed open a metal door that led into an even darker hallway. The lights here flickered every few seconds, casting jumpy shadows along the walls. I felt like we were moving through a place not meant to be walked at night. My nerves prickled with every step. Finally, Maria stopped in front of a steel door marked Surgical Wing Sieve, restricted access. Authorized personnel only. The keycard reader beside it glowed red. This wing was rarely used. It was reserved for government cases, high-security transfers, or specialized procedures requiring privacy and discretion. Even I, despite having worked here for years, needed written authorization to enter. "Why are we here?" I asked, but my voice came out softer than I intended. Maria turned to me slowly, and I immediately saw the terror in her eyes. Not the restrained kind. Not the professional kind. Actual fear. The kind that spreads like ice through the veins. "Listen to me," she whispered, gripping my arms tightly. "Whatever you do, don't let them know you're here." "Them." I felt my stomach twist. "Maria, what do you mean?" "Who is?" She didn't let me finish. She swallowed hard, then said the words that made my world tilt. "Your husband is inside." "Ethan." "My husband." Those words hit me like a blow. My mind instantly scrambled for logic. Ethan was a physical therapist. He wasn't allowed in surgery rooms, especially not this restricted one. He didn't even like hospitals after hours. He would wait in the car if he had to pick me up. "Ethan," I repeated slowly, as though the name itself had suddenly become unfamiliar. Maria nodded, and her voice shook when she added, "And it's a trap." "A trap." My breath caught in my throat. 1,000 questions flooded my mind at once. What was Ethan doing here? Who brought him? What trap? Who was them? Why this wing? But Maria held my shoulders firmly, as if trying to keep me from falling apart. "Hide," she whispered urgently. "Please. Just hide." My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what was on the other side. I only knew one thing: Ethan was inside, and if he was in danger, or worse, I needed to see for myself. Maria tried to stop me, but I slipped past her and pressed my ear to the door. I could hear voices, low, sharp, a tense conversation muffled by surgical masks and heavy equipment. I pushed the door open just a fraction, enough to see through the crack. At first, I noticed the bright surgical lights illuminating the room. The room itself looked half prepared. Not fully sterile, not fully chaotic. A patient lay unconscious on the operating table, covered partially with drapes. Machines beeped steadily beside her. But none of that mattered. Because I saw him. Ethan. My husband stood by the table wearing surgical gloves, his face pale and strained. He wasn't dressed like a surgeon. He still had his everyday clothes beneath a borrowed gown. His hands were shaking visibly. And next to him stood 3 men I had never seen in my life. They wore medical scrubs but no hospital badges. Their postures were stiff, alert, and threatening. Not at all like trained medical staff. My heart stopped when Ethan lifted his gaze and looked straight at me. For a moment, everything froze. I forgot how to breathe. His expression went from fear to shock to panic in seconds. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to warn me, scream at me, or tell me to run. I stayed frozen behind the door, unable to move, unable to decide whether to rush in or flee. I watched as one of the unknown men stepped closer to Ethan, saying something I couldn't hear. Ethan nodded quickly, too quickly, like he was scared, like he was being forced. And then, something happened that made the floor feel like it crumbled beneath me. One of the men pointed toward the table, toward the unconscious woman, and then toward Ethan, as if giving an order. A command. A demand. Ethan hesitated, his hands shaking harder. He looked at the woman. Then he looked at the tool in his hand. Then he looked again toward the crack in the door. Toward me. My heart filled with cold dread. Because I realized something in that instant. Whatever he was about to do, he didn't want to do it. He was scared. He was trapped. And Maria was right. I wasn't supposed to be here. My breathing grew loud in my own ears, and I instinctively stepped back. The crack in the door widened slightly, and the metal hinges creaked. It was barely audible, but it was enough. One of the men snapped his head toward the door. Ethan's face drained of all color. His eyes widened in horror. I froze completely. The man took one step toward me. And Ethan moved at the exact same time, just enough for him to shout something I couldn't fully hear. Something that sounded like, "Don't!" I stumbled backward, letting the door fall shut silently. Maria caught my arm and dragged me into the shadows beside the supply shelves. "What did you see?" she whispered urgently. My breath hitched. "Ethan, and 3 men. They're not doctors, Maria. They're not staff. Something's wrong. Something is very, very wrong." She nodded gravely, confirming my worst fear. "I tried to stop them, but they threatened me too. They said if anyone interfered, it would end badly." My throat tightened. "For who?" I whispered. She didn't answer. The silence was louder than anything she could have said. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I pressed them over my mouth, trying to calm my breathing. My mind raced through every moment of the past week, searching for something, anything, that could explain how my husband ended up in a restricted operating room under the control of strangers. Finally, unable to stay still any longer, I looked at the door again. Ethan was in there, and whatever trap this was, I wasn't about to let him face it alone. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the air in the corridor felt suffocating. I pressed my back against the cold wall, trying to steady my racing heart. Maria stood beside me, her fingers twisting the edge of her scrubs anxiously. I felt like my mind had split into 2 parts. One that was still the logical doctor, trying to comprehend what I'd witnessed, and another that was a terrified wife desperate to understand why her husband was standing beside an unconscious woman in a restricted surgical wing with 3 strangers dressed like surgeons. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the steel door, but eventually the muffled voices inside grew louder. I could hear the scrape of metal instruments, the steady beeping of monitors, and one voice, Ethan's, strained and trembling. My chest tightened at the sound. "I have to go in," I whispered, more to myself than to Maria. "No," she hissed, grabbing my wrist. "Lena, you can't. They're dangerous. You don't know what they're capable of." "But my husband is in there," I said, my voice cracking. Maria's eyes softened, but fear still lined her expression. "I know. But you cannot walk into that room blindly. You have to think. Think." As if thinking was possible with adrenaline tearing through my veins. "What do they want from him?" I whispered. Maria hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the door. "I don't know everything. I only know they came looking for someone with medical clearance. When they couldn't find you, they took him." "My." I blinked. "They were looking for me." Maria looked down at her hands. "Yes." My stomach plummeted. "Why?" I demanded. "Why would they want me?" Before she could answer, a sudden crash came from inside the OR, metal clattering against the floor. Both of us flinched. My instincts screamed at me to run inside, consequences be damned. But then, I heard something. A sound I'd know anywhere. Ethan's voice. "Stop! Don't touch her!" The words were clear, desperate, and full of fear. Something inside me snapped. I stepped forward, ready to push open the door, but before I could, it swung open on its own. The abrupt movement startled both of us, and we stood frozen as one of the strangers stepped into the hallway. He was tall, much taller than I realized when looking through the crack in the door, with sharp, predatory features and cold eyes that flicked between me and Maria. He didn't look surprised to see us. If anything, he looked amused. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with menace, "seems we have company sooner than expected." I felt Maria tense beside me. The man's gaze landed on me. "You must be Dr. Lena." Hearing my name in his voice sent a chill crawling down my spine. I didn't answer. My fists clenched at my sides. He tilted his head slightly, studying me like one might examine an unsettling specimen. "Your husband told us you were smart. Let's hope for his sake he was right." My pulse pounded so hard I felt dizzy. "What do you want from us?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, revealing enough of the room that I could see Ethan. He was still beside the table, his hands trembling as he held a medical instrument. His face was pale and slick with sweat. When his eyes found mine, I saw pure dread. "Lena, please," he whispered. "Don't come in." But it was too late. The tall man gestured toward the room with a fox-polite sweep of his hand. "Join us." Every instinct I had screamed at me not to move, but my feet ignored my brain. I stepped inside. The room was even colder than the hallway. Bright surgical lights glared down, casting harsh shadows along the floor. The unconscious woman on the table lay still, her chest rising and falling in slow, sedated breaths. She looked familiar, though I couldn't place her. Maybe I had seen her once in triage or on a stretcher being rushed through the ER. Or maybe she reminded me of someone else. The other two men stood near the counters, flipping through medical files. Except they weren't normal files. They were mine. My name appeared on almost every sheet, stamped in bold letters. "What is this?" I asked, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. One of the men held up a page containing a security still shot, grainy, black and white, but unmistakable. It was me. Me walking through the hospital parking garage last week. My face partially turned. My purse slung over my shoulder, my keycard in my hand. But in the background of the photo was something else. A man. He was standing near an SUV. Another man was lying on the ground beside him, unmoving. I remembered that moment vaguely. The loud crash, the echo of raised voices. I'd thought it was a fight or some kind of emergency. I'd gotten into my car quickly, not wanting to intrude on whatever was happening. "What does this have to do with me?" I whispered. The tall man walked toward me slowly, like a predator playing with prey. "You saw something you were not supposed to see." My throat constricted. "I saw a scuffle in a parking lot. That's all," he smiled. Not a pleasant smile, but one filled with chilling certainty. "You saw enough." I suddenly understood. The man on the ground, the unconscious one, must have been hurt, maybe even killed. And I, without realizing it, had walked straight past a crime. A crime someone wanted erased. And the woman on the table, I asked, nodding toward her. What does she have to do with any of this? She saw the same thing, he said simply. She recorded us. My stomach dropped. Recorded you. He nodded once. We needed someone with full hospital access to retrieve the data she hid. A doctor who had the authority to log into confidential systems, access patient files, security footage, emergency logs. Someone who could walk everywhere without suspicion. Someone like me, I said softly. He smiled again, darker this time. Exactly. But you didn't get me, I said. You got Ethan. At the sound of his name, Ethan flinched slightly. The tall man shrugged. He volunteered. A shock ran through me. Volunteered, but Ethan's gaze avoided mine. I didn't want them to take you, he said quietly. They came to the house. They threatened to drag you out of work. His voice cracked. I told them I would cooperate if they left you alone. The air thickened between us. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them back. This wasn't the time for emotion. Not when we were standing in the middle of danger. One of the men approached holding a tablet. On it was a medical database screen, my login prompt. You're going to help us access everything she touched, he said, nodding toward the unconscious woman. Where she was treated, who she spoke to, where her recording is. And if I refuse? I asked, though I already sensed the answer. The tall man gestured toward Ethan. Then your husband becomes unnecessary. I stepped instinctively in front of Ethan, my body moving before my mind could catch up. Don't touch him. The tall man arched a brow. Then cooperate. For a moment, I considered pretending to help, stalling, trying to outsmart them. But with 3 dangerous men watching my every move, and Ethan's life hanging in the balance, it wasn't a risk I could take, not yet. I moved to the workstation reluctantly. The tablet screen glowed, waiting for my credentials. My fingertips hovered over the keys, trembling uncontrollably. Behind me, Ethan whispered, "Lena, please don't." I looked at him, my eyes burning. "What choice do we have?" I whispered back. The tall man cleared his throat. "No stalling." I pressed my key code. The system unlocked. They moved instantly. One grabbed the files, another advanced to the machine storing encrypted data from surveillance cameras. Their tension-filled urgency made the room feel even colder. Then one of the men swore under his breath. "The file isn't here." The tall man's voice sharpened. "Explain." "This woman," the man said, pointing at the unconscious patient. "She lied. She didn't store the recording in her file. She must have hidden it somewhere else." The tall man turned to me slowly. "Find it." I shook my head. "I don't know where she put it. I don't even know who she is." He stepped closer until his face hovered inches from mine. "Learn." Behind him, one of the men moved toward the patient with a syringe, large, filled with something thick. I recognized the substance instantly. Pentobarbital. A lethal dose. "Stop," I shouted. But the tall man raised a hand, signaling the man to pause. "Then help us." My chest tightened. My pulse thundered in my ears. The woman on the table might be the only person who could prove what happened that night, and the only leverage these men had. I swallowed hard. "Fine, I'll help. Just don't hurt her." The tall man lowered his hand, and the man with the syringe stepped back. I turned to the patient, feeling for a pulse out of instinct. Strong, stable, still under sedation. Whoever she was, she had been fighting for her life long before we walked into this room. As I searched through the files, scanning for clues, Ethan moved beside me. His whisper trembled. "I'm sorry, Lena. I didn't want you dragged into this." I didn't look at him. "If I did, I might break." "We're getting out of this," I whispered. "Both of us." But even as the words left my lips, I knew the situation was spiraling fast, and then everything erupted at once. One of the men cursed loudly. "Security is moving on this wing. Someone triggered an alert. Maria. She must have done it." The tall man spun around, fury twisting his features. "We need to move. Now." He reached for the syringe the man had set down. But I moved before he did. Everything happened in a blur, shouting, footsteps, alarms blaring through the hallway. And in the chaos, I made a decision that would change everything. I knocked the syringe out of his hand and threw myself between him and Ethan. The room exploded with violence. Chaos detonated in the room the moment my hand struck the syringe away. It clattered across the floor, skidding beneath a rolling cart, disappearing under a tangle of wires. For a moment, everything went still. Just the sound of alarms screaming through the hallway and the rapid thud of my heartbeat pounding in my skull. Then, the tall man lunged. "Grab her," he roared. But Ethan moved faster. He slammed his shoulder into the tall man's chest, sending him stumbling backward into a tray of instruments. The clatter of metal rang through the room like a gunshot. The other two men snapped out of shock instantly, one grabbing for the patient, the other reaching inside his scrub pocket as though searching for a weapon. Ethan pulled me back, shielding me with his body as the tall man regained his balance. His face twisted with fury. "You want to die here?" he growled. "Fine." He moved toward Ethan with terrifying speed. I didn't think. I acted. My hand shot out toward the nearest object, a defibrillator paddle. I gripped it with both hands, the weight heavier than I remembered from normal use. And as the tall man lunged for Ethan again, I swung the paddle with all the strength left in my trembling body. The metal struck him across the shoulder and jaw. He stumbled sideways with a shout, crashing onto the floor. "Run!" Ethan yelled. But we couldn't. Not yet. The man nearest the unconscious woman had grabbed a pair of surgical scissors and was raising them above her chest, as if ready to end the only witness who could expose everything. "No." I yelled and rushed him without thinking. He swung the scissors toward me, the blade catching the edge of my sleeve. I felt the sharp sting of it grazing my skin. Before he could bring it down again, I slammed into him with my shoulder. The force knocked him off balance. His back struck the surgical table, jarring the unconscious woman. Ethan was on him in an instant, grappling for control of the scissors. They struggled violently, grunting, both straining for leverage. I grabbed the man's wrist and bit down hard, my teeth sinking into flesh. He screamed, loosening his grip, and the scissors clattered to the floor. The third man sprinted toward the door, trying to escape, but Maria appeared in the doorway. Blood drained from my face. "Maria, don't!" I cried. But she wasn't alone. Behind her were 2 security officers and another nurse. The man barreled toward them, trying to shove his way out, but the officers subdued him within seconds. The moment he went down, the officers rushed into the OR. "Step away from the patient," one of them ordered, hands where we can see them. But it wasn't over. The tall man, blood on his lip, fury in his eyes, rose from the floor and grabbed a surgical scalpel from a tray. With a roar, he lunged straight toward me. I froze. Ethan didn't. He tackled the man mid-charge, the scalpel slicing through the air inches from my face. The two crashed to the ground, rolling violently across the tile floor. "Ethan," I cried, panic shredding my voice. The tall man was stronger, much stronger. He pinned Ethan beneath him, raising the scalpel with both hands, ready to drive it down into him. "No," I screamed and launched myself onto the tall man's back. He jerked, startled, and the scalpel plunged downward, not into Ethan, but sideways, grazing his arm. Ethan cried out, but it wasn't deep. Adrenaline kept me moving. I wrapped my arms around the tall man's neck, pulling with every ounce of desperation I had. Security swarmed us. One officer struck the tall man with a baton, knocking the scalpel from his grip. Another tackled him fully off Ethan. The scalpel skittered under the counter. And then, silence. Horrible, ringing silence. The 3 men were restrained, handcuffed, and dragged from the room. The unconscious patient was quickly surrounded by real medical staff, stabilizing her condition. Security officers shouted orders into radios, sealing the entire wing and calling the police. I stood there in the center of it all, trembling so violently I felt like my bones might shatter. Ethan stumbled to his feet, gripping his wounded arm. Blood trickled down his sleeve. His eyes found mine, wide with fear, not of the men, not of the situation. Fear of losing me. "Lena," he whispered. I rushed into his arms, burying my face against his chest, his hands wrapped around me tightly, holding me as if afraid I might vanish. "It's okay," I whispered, not sure if I was comforting him or myself. "It's over. It's over." But I knew it wasn't truly over. Not yet. Within minutes, police filled the room, escorting the men into custody. The woman on the table, still barely conscious under sedation, was transferred to another secure unit for protection. Maria stayed by my side, gripping my hand tightly, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I tried to warn you." "You saved us," I said softly. "If you hadn't triggered the alert," she shook her head. "You would have done the same for anyone in this hospital." When the officers finished gathering preliminary statements, one detective approached us. He was older, his face lined with years of grim cases, but his voice was steady and reassuring. "We'll need full statements from both of you," he said. "But first, you two need medical checks. And maybe a moment." He stepped aside respectfully. Ethan and I sat on a nearby bench in the hallway as EMTs wrapped his arm. The wound wasn't deep, but it was raw, jagged. My hands shook as I held the bandage steady while they taped it in place. He winced slightly, then exhaled. "You shouldn't have come in," he whispered. "You shouldn't have been here at all," I countered softly. He looked down, guilt pulling at his expression. "I didn't know what else to do. They said they'd hurt you if I didn't cooperate. They showed me pictures. Pictures of you leaving work, walking to your car, sitting in the cafe across the street. They'd been following you, following us." A cold shiver ran through me. "How long?" I asked. "A week," he whispered. "Since the night you saw that man in the parking lot." That night. The night I dismissed as nothing more than hospital chaos. I had no idea I'd been walking straight past a violent crime. "I should have told you," he said, his voice breaking. I didn't want to scare you. I thought if I did what they wanted, they'd leave you alone." I lifted his chin gently so he would look at me. "You protected me," I said. "And I'm not angry at you. I'm angry that this happened at all. But you." My voice softened, cracking with emotion. "You saved my life tonight." He shook his head. "You saved mine." We fell silent, the weight of it all finally settling. The fear, the danger, the realization of how close we came to losing each other. After a long moment, Ethan exhaled shakily. "Lena, what happens now?" I looked around at the chaos: police reports, sealed hallways, a hospital wing filled with shaken staff. The unconscious witness being wheeled away under guard, the three men being shoved into squad cars outside, and Maria watching me with quiet relief. Now came the investigation's statements, protection details, and sleepless nights. The aftermath, the healing. But there was one thing I knew with absolute certainty. "We move forward," I said, taking his hand. "Together. No more secrets. No more fear." He squeezed my hand, his eyes brimming with emotion. "I promise." As the police escorted us to a secure interview room, I looked back one last time at the operating room. The lights still glaring, instruments scattered across the floor, the metallic scent of adrenaline and fear still lingering in the air. The trap they set for me had failed. But it left a mark I knew would never completely fade. Still, as I walked with Ethan beside me, alive, safe, holding my hand tightly, I felt something stronger than fear. Survival, courage, and the certainty that no matter how dark the night had been, we had stepped out of it together, and nothing, not even the terror we'd faced, could take that away from us.